Chinese President Xi Jinping joins world leaders in Washington, D.C. to address nuclear security. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Washington, D.C. for the Nuclear Security Summit. The Chinese leader is joining delegations from more than 50 countries to address securing nuclear materials and the threat of nuclear terrorism. On Thursday afternoon, President Xi met with US President Barack Obama for bilateral talks at the Washington Convention Center. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Nathan King. He joins us now. Nathan, let's start with the summit. This is a vital issue, nuclear security. What are the leaders hoping to accomplish?
Well, it sounds simple. Secure nuclear supplies so that they don't fall into the wrong hands, i.e. terrorists and bad actors. But as you know, the nuclear industry, especially the military side, is extremely secretive. There are lots of sovereignty issues at stake. And also, the nuclear civilian industry is very domestic, and of course, lots of competition among companies as well. So this is where countries are coming together with a goal they can all agree on, which is trying to stop nuclear material going into the hands of terrorists. And it doesn't just reside in nuclear power plants and in weapons factories, but also in hospitals, in junkyards where it's being got rid of. So there's lots of areas to talk about going forward. The big criticism of this sort of summit is that countries themselves come with so-called diplomatic gift baskets where they basically offer unilateral pledges of stuff they're going to do that isn't internationally binding. But the organizers, i.e. the White House, say that about 2,000 metric tons of nuclear material available in the world, about half of that has already been secured. So there's a lot more work to be done, but still there's been a lot of progress.
Nathan, President Xi also held a face-to-face meeting with President Obama, a bilateral, as it's known in diplomatic speak. What did they talk about?
Well, first of all, terrorism, you know, with the Belgian attacks and the Lahore attacks that we've been talking about, and the fact that Belgian terrorists looked like they were trying to get some sort of radiological device, that was top of the agenda. Let's listen to the Chinese President Xi Jinping about that and other issues.
恐怖主义威胁是日益的上升。
The terrorist threat is on the rise. As the largest developing country and the largest developed country, and also as the world's top two economies, China and the United States have growing responsibilities for promoting world peace, stability, and prosperity. There are wide areas where we should and we can work with each other.
Two pieces of news, though, out of that bilateral meeting. First of all, President Xi Jinping and US President Obama issued a statement on nuclear security where they both agreed to turn high-enriched uranium nuclear power plants into low-enriched uranium ones, some in China, some in Africa as well. What does that mean? It means that the material inside, the nuclear material, won't be able to be used as weapons. They've also had another agreement, and that's on the outcome of the Paris Climate Conference. Basically, that agreement is up for signature on April the 22nd. They both pledged to sign it on that day. Doesn't sound like a lot, but they will basically be putting their signatures and encouraging the rest of the world to get on board of climate change. As you know, that's one area they can agree on, but there's lots they don't.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting from the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington. Joining us now from Seattle is Ambassador Gary Locke. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to China from 2011 to 2014, was appointed U.S. Commerce Secretary in the Obama administration, and is the former governor of Washington State. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Right now we have the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's in Washington for the Nuclear Security Summit. You had a chance to meet President Xi last year when he was in Seattle. How do you see this relationship between China and the United States evolving?
Well, the U.S.-China relationship is perhaps stronger today than it has ever been. There are so many cooperative efforts underway between our businesses, our scientists, our academics, and of course military and political leaders. Our economies are so intertwined. China is, for instance, America's largest export destination of our products and produce and things that we grow on our farms. And millions of jobs on both sides of the Pacific depend on trade with each other.
You know, you say the economies are intertwined, and that is something that the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has been talking about. Chinese leaders, as you know, have been promoting this idea, this platform of major country relationships, a major country relationship with the United States. Let's listen to what Premier Li Keqiang had to say about this. Let's watch.
For some time, many people have been talking about the differences, but they neglect an important thing that happened last year between China and the United States. That is that China became the biggest trading partner of the U.S., with a trade volume reaching $560 billion US. It shows that the common interests between China and the United States are bigger than their differences.
We have Premier Li Keqiang talking about the relationship, the economic relationship between China and the United States. He was talking there at the closing news conference at the National People's Congress. Does the United States need to do more to promote the common interest of these two countries?
Well, we do have a lot of common interests. For instance, our scientists are working together on finding cures for cancer, finding drugs that can overcome some of the new drug-resistant strains of TB. And there's a lot of clinical trials going on between our two countries. We're, of course, working together very closely on climate change, helping lead the world efforts in that regard. And, of course, China was very involved with the United States in trying to get, in successfully getting Iran to stop developing a nuclear weapon. And we're working together with China on trying to put pressure on North Korea to also stop developing a nuclear weapon. Our scientists are working together, our businesses are working together. Of course, more can be done. Western companies feel that there's still discrimination by the Chinese against foreign firms, and a lot of the markets are closed off to foreign firms, including American firms. And so there's much more to be done, but the relationship is very, very strong.
The Chinese economy, as you are aware, is going through something of a transitional period right now. How do you evaluate China's regional and global development, thinking of things like the establishment of the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank and the One Belt, One Road initiative?
Well, I think China is really trying to reach out to its neighbors and trying to use its financial means, along with the assistance of other countries around the world, in helping develop the Asia-Pacific region and bringing greater prosperity to the people around China. China's transformation has been absolutely dramatic over the last several decades. And, you know, China is one of the world's oldest civilizations, and yet at the same time one of its most modern. And the upbringing or the lifting of so many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in such a very short period of time is absolutely unparalleled in world history. So China now is trying to bring greater prosperity to peoples in other countries in the region with the assistance of other countries through this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And of course, they're trying to promote trade with their neighbors. At the same time, China has a huge appetite, and the Chinese people have a huge appetite for made in America U.S. goods. As well as services, whether it's environmental technology, medical devices, medicine, medical treatment, care of the elderly. There's a lot that American companies can do to help bring greater prosperity for the Chinese people while creating jobs here at home in America. And those are the win-win scenarios that we need to continue to push for.
Right, talking of creating jobs, China is very big on the idea of creating a green economy to boost long-term growth. So how does China and the United States get together on this particular aspect of their economies to cooperate, bringing more jobs?
Well, obviously, China and the United States are partnering together on combating climate change with very aggressive targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is that if America were to move aggressively ahead on reducing climate change and China does nothing, all of our efforts in America will be for naught, and vice versa. If China is very aggressive in reducing its carbon emissions, but America does little, then the world will not benefit. China produces more greenhouse gases than any other country in the world, but they have 4 times the population of America. We in America produce more greenhouse gases per person than any other country in the world. So the planet is looking for leadership from both the United States and China to join forces in combating climate change. And there is so much cooperation going on between our two countries. Cities in China are looking for American technology, American engineering to help them clean up the air as well as clean up the rivers and streams that are so badly polluted in China. So that's a sweet spot. We can work together on climate change, bring more renewable energy to the world, and supply it to the world, at the same time creating jobs for both Americans here at home as well as the Chinese.
Right, I want to move on to some political and security issues. One issue that has been preoccupying both the United States and China is the nuclear threat, which is posed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, the United States and China have worked together to come up with sanctions against the DPRK for its nuclear program. Do you think that they could work together to get the six-party talks to resume again?
Well, China and the United States have been talking about how to resume those six-party talks, and we're very pleased that China more recently joined with the United Nations and other countries in imposing toughest sanctions ever against North Korea in reaction to their most recent launches of missiles and testing of a nuclear weapon or nuclear materials. So it's gratifying to see that China is applying more pressure and supportive of even more pressure against the North Korean regime. Because if North Korea does in fact develop a nuclear weapon and is able to successfully deploy it and launch it, it poses a very deep threat to the United States, to Japan, and others of our allied nations.
Do you think China is in a better position than anyone else to defuse this crisis, to bring pressure to bear on the DPRK?
Well, China is a critical player because China and North Korea are very close allies, and in fact North Korea depends so heavily on aid from China to keep the economy and the country really propped up. Without China, North Korea would really collapse.
Looking at another issue, and that is we've just seen these horrendous attacks by Islamic State. They've claimed responsibility for these attacks in Brussels. How significant is it? How important is it for world leaders like the Chinese leader, like the United States leader, to get together to combat these kinds of attacks around the world?
Well, terrorism knows no international boundaries, and so it's in the interest of peace-loving countries to really come together and talk about this issue and start deploying a coordinated strategy on defeating ISIS or ISIL. China has a very large Islamic Muslim population as well, and it's in their best interest to make sure that they're attending to the needs and the grievances and the concerns of the Muslim population in China to make sure that there is no breeding ground for terrorism within China, or that terrorists from around the world do not come into China. So making sure that we have secure borders, that we share intelligence, that we're working with other nations in the Middle East and elsewhere to really try to stamp out ISIL is in the interest of all peace-loving countries. This is an effort that must unite all the freedom-loving and peace-loving countries around the world.
Ambassador, you've been very closely involved in the U.S.-China relationship. What are your impressions of President Xi's leadership and the diplomacy that he is conducting?
Well, obviously, he's a very charismatic individual and is very popular within his own country. He's much more relaxed in talking with world leaders. He's really trying to move the country forward, and I think that he also has a pride of China and wants to bring China onto the world stage and does not want to be second fiddle. So you're seeing a lot of international diplomatic efforts. He's traveling the world, establishing agreements with other countries, providing assistance to other countries, really trying to restore the pride of China that China has long felt for many, many centuries, and bringing that to bear on the international stage.
Ambassador Gary Locke, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
We are going to take a break right now. Next, we'll discuss China's foreign policy and diplomacy. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. Before making his way to the United States, Chinese President Xi Jinping made his first state visit to the Czech Republic. President Xi and Czech Republic President Miloš Zeman witnessed the signing of a wide range of business deals, from automobiles to finance and tourism. China also promoted its Belt and Road initiatives. Well, joining us now from New York is Nong Hong. She's the Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. From London, we're joined by Stephen Perry. He is the chairman of the 48th Group Club and a writer and commentator on China. Also with us from Beijing is Jie Xuedong. He's a senior research fellow with the China Institute of International Studies. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Jie Xuedong, let me start with you. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Washington right now for the Nuclear Security Summit. He will also be holding a bilateral meeting with President Obama. What do you expect to come out of these meetings?
Well, the Nuclear Security Summit is a success story for China-US cooperation in this regard. So I believe that President Xi Jinping will show that China is willing to continue to work with the United States to improve nuclear security around the world. At the bilateral level, of course, the two presidents are expected to compare notes on major issues, bilaterally, regionally, and globally. For example, President Xi Jinping might share his view and comment about the status of Chinese economy and what China is doing to maintain a momentum of economic growth, and while at the same time work with other countries for a balanced economy for the world. Of course, they have a lot of other issues to address to manage their differences, for example, over the South China Sea issue, so that it will not become an area of strategic rivalry.
Okay, Stephen Perry, I just want to take a step back to the earlier visit President Xi made to the Czech Republic. It was the first visit that he made to Central Europe as head of state. The president said that this visit marks the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. What is the significance of that trip?
Well, first of all, the Czech Republic is one of the most beautiful countries. It's right at the center of Europe. It's right at the center of European history. It's a country with a very educated population and quite a sophisticated engineering set of activities. And if you may recall, after the Soviet Union ended, the Germans moved in to support Skoda and invested in Skoda, and Skoda has become one of the world's great brands. So I think when China looks at the Czech Republic, it's looking at a country with a deep history and an opportunity for a combination which will help both countries significantly. But beyond that, we're looking at the western end of OBOR, One Belt, One Road, the new Silk Roads. As the Silk Roads begin to develop into Europe, it is in the Czech Republic and around there that the real activity on the western end of it in Europe will be seen. So it's important from that point of view. Also, the Czech president attended the 60th VA anniversary in Beijing, and the relations between Central and Eastern European states and China is not so well understood in many places, but 16+1 is the relationship between those Central and Eastern European states and China, and the 16 heads of state visited China, Hangzhou, in December and had meetings at the premier level with Premier Li Keqiang, and this is raising the level of relationship between those states, and in particular the Czech Republic and China, to that of a presidential level. Usually when Xi Jinping visits a big country, he usually visits a smaller country as well. So this is very typical of his travel, of what is probably the most traveled Chinese president I've ever seen.
Nong Hong, let's go to the other side of the Atlantic right now and look at the relationship between the United States and China. One of the big differences between these two countries, and it seems to emerge very frequently, is the status of islands in the South China Sea. They've been the source of rising tensions between Washington and Beijing. There are issues of China's sovereignty, there's issues of China's territorial integrity. What do you think is a constructive approach to resolving this?
Well, It's very interesting development. The South China Sea used to reflect the differences among the six claimant parties in terms of sovereignty claims, in terms of maritime sovereign rights, on the interpretation of Law of Sea Convention and international law. But right now, what's being presented to us, it has become an issue between the United States and China, which already affect the U.S.-China relations, and which represent the two interest groups of the Law of Sea Convention. One is the coastal state by China, the other is like user state by United States. And I think if we understand correctly from U.S. Official statement, its concerns in the South China Sea is based on its concern about whether its freedom of navigation will be affected by the existing maritime disputes. And it's also concerned whether South China Sea will be peaceful or stable. If that is what the American is actually looking for, that's exactly the same goal with China. Well, freedom of navigation, also peaceful and stable situation in the South China Sea will meet each other's common goal.
Jie Shedong, another issue of deep concern to both countries, and that is the threat, the nuclear threat from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And there appears to be a fundamental difference here between the United States and China on how they approach this. China is looking at a change in policy, and the United States is looking at a change in regime. So, how do they resolve this?
Certainly at this moment, people may feel frustrated that we see a situation of more nuclear tests and missile launches, followed by more United Nations Security Council sanctions, followed again by more nuclear tests and missile launches. It's kind of a cycle of escalating tensions, and the escalated tensions do no one good. So at the end of the day, diplomatic solution will be the only viable option, actually, because no parties on the Korean Peninsula and in the region can afford a war or even or confrontation between the DPRK and the United States, or the DPRK and the ROK, Republic of Korea. And of course, at this moment, it's very difficult to resume the six-party talks, which is a process which has achieved some progress in the past, but it has been installed for several years. The situation may get worse before it's getting better. That being said, there's still hope, because behind all the rhetoric of tough talks of the DPRK, there are still, I can kind of hope that the country, DPRK, can talk with the United States directly, and also the ROK also would like to have a kind of bilateral dialogue with the DPRK, even though it's this will be very difficult at this moment.
Stephen Perry, looking broadly at China's role in the world, it is making its presence felt on the international stage. As you pointed out a moment ago, President Xi Jinping is one of the most traveled Chinese presidents. He's attended most of the important global summits, and he attended something like 14 major nations last year alone. So when we look at China now playing a role at the Nuclear Security Summit, do you think that's going to be a pretty important and big role there?
Oh yes, I think we've seen quite a significant change in China's presence in the world. Whilst it still stands by its principles of peaceful coexistence and non-interference in other nations, its presence in the discussions between nations to address major crises have had a significant effect. And probably the best example of that is the situation in Iran. And if we go back a few years, people were talking about a similar situation with Iran that they're now talking about with North Korea. The policy of China of engagement, of discussions, of negotiations, and combined with other measures, led to a solution in the Iran situation that was acceptable to all. So when you just posed the question just now about the difference between the American approach and the Chinese approach on North Korea, it was actually the issue of negotiations and six-party talks that the Chinese wanted to have in the United Nations resolution for it to be approved. It was this combination of both sides of the argument of the ways of getting countries motivated to find solutions. So I think we're seeing the presence of China in terms of the words that are used, because China is now recognized by America, by Europe, as being a nation that needs to be taken into account in working out ways of getting important resolutions through the Security Council.
Nong Hong, how do you see Chinese foreign policy evolve in the future? There are some scholars who say that there is a belief in China that the world is now in the midst of a historic change that might see the end of US domination on the globe. And we heard the Chinese leaders telling us just a few weeks ago that Foreign Minister Wang Yi said he talked of building a new type of major power relationship. How is that goal unfolding? What did he mean by that?
Well, that's a very bold and very important concept raised by Chinese government about the new type of new relations between the great power. I think the key concept in this phrase about the mutual trust and the peaceful coexistence and also healthy competition and also win-win and through cooperation. I think those key concepts should be respected and should be recognized by China and the United States. I think what China is not seeking or taking the same approach as the States to aiming to dominate the international system. I think China is actually in a learning process of how to become a responsible and also playing a constructive role in global affairs. I think in this regard on how to build up a new type of great relationship between China and the United States, I think, well, given there are a lot of common interests between the United States, such as climate change and such as cybersecurity, such as like in the cooperation in maritime domain, there's a lot of ways for the two countries to work together to find a common grounds and to defeat the differences and to find a way that how to coincidence or win to achieve the win-win solution in global affairs.
Right. Stephen Perry, one final point on the China-Europe relationship. Is China here looking at Europe as a market now for Chinese companies? You know, the biggest trade relationship, of course, is between China and the United States, but is China now rebalancing, saying we've got to look to Europe as well?
Well, I don't think there's a very significant shift in that respect. The Chinese have long looked upon Europe as an important destination for their goods, for their companies, and now increasingly for their investment, especially as investment between America and China is a little bit difficult. Europe does present some better opportunities for China. But the important change in the relationship between Europe and China is going to be around One Belt, One Road. This transformatory economic development which will sweep across Central Asia into Eastern, Central and Western Europe is going to transform the economic opportunities for Europe. And this is coming from China, so that the Europeans are getting ready to respond to the Chinese initiative for this whole new playing field called Eurasia. I think it's a great time for Europe-China relations.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. For our complete coverage of the Nuclear Summit, visit global.cctv-america.com. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.